Just formally wanted to welcome you to the 2022 Northwest Minnesota Regional Housing Forum. We're glad to see so many people here today. I'm Warren Hansen, president of Greater Minnesota Housing Fund. Today's Regional Housing Forum for the Northwest region is co-hosted by Minnesota Housing, the Northwest Minnesota Foundation, Headwaters Regional Development Commission, and Greater Minnesota Housing Fund. We're excited today to have Commissioner Jennifer Ho here with us. Jennifer has really helped maintain the bipartisan support at the legislature for affordable housing, something that we've had the luxury in Minnesota of having for really decades now. And the commissioner has provided just great leadership on the emergency rent assistance and the operations of the agency under this difficult time. So thank you, Commissioner Ho, for being here today and providing your leadership to our field. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Warren, and thank you to you and to your whole team for partnering on putting this together. I've been just scrolling the attendance list, and it's great to see folks who I have met, but a lot of folks I haven't, and but nice to see some old friends on screen. And of course, we've got a great showing from Minnesota Housing. My team will be there, and then also Minnesota Housing alumni. It's fun to see folks who have been at Minnesota Housing at one point or another in their career. It's a great time for me to pitch and say that the state's learned a lot about telework, and one of the things that really opens up for us is that you can work for Minnesota Housing from any part of the state. So if you always thought state government wasn't for you because you didn't want to come down to the cities, we have figured out so much about the telework environment in the last almost 2 years now that we really do want to make sure that folks understand that we think that we'll actually be better in the long haul if we have staff who are staffing us from all parts of the state and really tuned in to local housing needs in that way. So if you've ever thought about a career at the state, now's a great time to do it, because even when we do have the opportunity to go back to the office, we know that how we do our work is going to be forever transformed, and really figuring out how to do work in these hybrid models, because so many people have found it beneficial in terms of juggling a commute or on a snowy day like today, not having to climb in the car and do all that. And I think the thing that's so remarkable is how much work we have actually been able to get done. We have done more at Minnesota Housing in the last 2 years in our regular lines of business because of the fact that people keep buying homes and we keep lending, and because we've had a couple strong legislative sessions in terms of investment and housing infrastructure bonds and our appropriated programs, we're just doing more. And then on top of that, of course, all of the federal stimulus money and what we have done in partnership with so many of you to do that one-time unexpected work as well. Today is coincidentally the governor's kickoff of the local jobs and projects, the opportunity that we have for housing infrastructure bonds and public housing preservation. We're jumping ahead of him a little bit, but I'll just say I'm excited by the opportunity to go big. I feel like this is actually a period of time where it feels like we're going even bigger. And that we need to. Warren, I agree completely. For those of us that have been focused on housing, I think we've known pre-pandemic, how very vital having a stable home that you can afford is just to life itself. Whether that's a place to raise a family, or whether that's aging in place as we grow older. Proximity to work for folks who do have to work on the job, But also, our homes have become our schools, our offices, oftentimes even our healthcare settings and everything else. And so our homes are so important, and the affordability of those homes, regardless of how much we make, and even if so many people have had disruptions in income in their lives over the course of the last couple of years. So I feel like we head into a 2022 legislative session with people having a deep appreciation of the importance of home, and that we're still trying to fill this mismatch between the number of households in Minnesota and our supply of housing, as well as the mismatch between the cost of that housing, whether it be a single family home for home ownership or it be a rental unit, the mismatch between what people can afford and what's out there. And so obviously at Minnesota Housing, our opportunity, working with both federal resources, but also with the legislature, is to be able to use our financing to really buy down that cost of housing. And it's, I guess it was good that we had kind of a slowing a bit of COVID. It allowed me to get out a bit across the state, which I sorely missed. Got to do, I used to joke, less than grand openings and some groundbreakings outside, socially distanced, masked. I was able to actually get out a little bit more between July and the fall and just see so much of the great work. But also there's no place I travel where the need for more isn't evident. And so I need your help this legislative session, because the governor is going to have a very go big housing agenda. And but we get this done when every single member of the legislature in the Minnesota House and the Minnesota Senate is hearing from their own constituents about the importance of making significant investments in housing for Minnesotans. When I go to a legislator's office in their district or on Zoom or up here at the Capitol, they expect me to say this. They expect Warren Hansen to argue for more housing resources. But what they want to hear is that their own constituents in their own communities view this as a high priority and help connect the dots between school stability, between employers' ability to attract employees in the region, and just about that livability, the livability of communities across the state. So that's one of the reasons I'm just really excited to see so many people participating in this discussion today. I have staff who are here with their laptops open and taking notes and really listening in small group discussions, in the chat, reading the chat, just seeing what it is that's on people's minds. And so encourage you to just really make sure that we hear from you loud and clear, even if it's in the chat, just what you're seeing, and that you take to heart the fact that you've got a representative in the House and you've got a representative in the state Senate, and they need to hear from you. And it's great if they hear from you at the beginning of session. Session starts on January 31st. It's great if they hear from you again in the middle of the session when they're putting their bills together. And it's important that they hear from you in those final weeks of session. I'll say allegedly in May, since the actual close date of session has been kind of a hard thing to pin down and predict these days. I just want you to know that the governor and lieutenant governor and I have every intention of highlighting the importance of making investments. We've got a very significant state budget surplus. The government's going to be talking about what to do with $1.2 billion of state fiscal recovery fund money that came to us from the Congress, as well as it being a bonding year. So there are lots of opportunities to grow our investments in housing this year, and I need your help. I need your help to just be committed to knowing who your legislators are, and be committed to making those calls, dropping those emails, swinging by their district office, or if you know them in your community, swinging by their home and just making sure that they know that housing is a priority. So with that, we've got an exciting agenda. And Warren, they said to go for an hour and a half, but I thought just 5 would probably be okay. But I really excited to have this event taking place today. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Commissioner Ho. And I'm glad you are kind of teeing up the discussion of the next legislative session, which is going to be very, very unique. And as you said, a lot of resources, a lot of new federal and state resources, state surplus and fiscal recovery funds that are still being deployed and allocated. And as we'll hear about a little bit later, or very soon actually, the advocate community is gearing up to get behind the agency and the agency's agenda, the governor's agenda, and maybe even advance that a little bit further. But we're going to need to be in high coordination and alignment to really persuade all sides of the legislature to champion housing. So let's move along. We've got just a little bit of a interesting exercise here for us, and it's a poll, an instant poll. And what you see on your screen right now are is a question with a few multiple choice answers. You can, I believe, you can pick up to 3 answers, and so if you just begin by clicking on which housing issues are most important to you, there's 2 questions here, but we're just going to do the first one and then see what the results are for the first one. Which housing issues are most important to you, to your community, to your organization? And feel free to just click on the ones that are most urgent or most important: ending homelessness, home ownership, new affordable housing, preserving affordable housing, state policy and legislation, working with employers on housing, or expanding community wealth by investing in emerging developers. So if you do click on those, Jeremiah will flag or close the poll and we'll see the results. Jeremiah, can I ask you, did you want us to answer both questions right now?
Yep, you can answer them together.
Okay, I misspoke there. So then please go ahead and answer question number 2 as well. Just a real quick question, 30 seconds. What has the pandemic impact been on your organization and community?
If you don't see the poll pop up automatically, you can select the polls option on your Zoom taskbar.
Okay. So I will vote. And we should be seeing some, here we are, we got results. So on the first question, what's most important to you in terms of the various housing issues? And it looks like we're fairly well distributed among the various possible housing strategies, everything from ending homelessness to home ownership. But you can see that the need for the urgency of new or expanded or greater supply of new affordable housing is kind of paramount. So that's a great response. And then question number 2, as you can see, the impact has been fairly well distributed. Very few people felt no impact, and most of us felt some moderate to high impact on the COVID pandemic, which of course is just continuing in its persistent way. So that is the instant poll, just a little exercise to see what people are thinking about. Let me just move along right now. We're a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to try and move it ahead. And we're going to have Cody Thurnow from Minnesota Housing present some housing data on the Northwest region and on the state. And Cody, it's all yours.
Yeah, hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I am not the commissioner with Minnesota Housing, but I am a research analyst with Minnesota Housing. Today I'm going to present some high-level insights to try to shed some light on trends that are being seen at the region at a high level. And I say high level as a lot of the data that I'm going to highlight today focuses on a large geographic area making up 12 counties in the Northwest. Jared, if you want to advance to the next slide, we can kind of show, sorry, the next, with the map there, the next one. So the kind of little bit darker, that's kind of a lot of what I'm going to highlight. I realize that a number of people in attendance today might represent organizations, communities just outside of this or in other parts, or developers that don't necessarily live here, but work in this region. And I am keeping it at a high level because really you all are the local experts, and that's kind of why we're here, is to hear from you what are the community housing challenges that you are seeing, recognizing that the housing challenges in Bemidji, Park Rapids, Halleck might all look different or have different solutions into how you might address those housing challenges. Next slide. Region as a whole, as we see across the majority of the state, is becoming more diverse. While the white non-Hispanic population still represents the large share of this region's population, it is changing. So are there specific housing challenges, solutions in order to represent the housing needs of a growing diverse population? With 3 of the larger tribal nations being located within or adjacent to this region, the American Indian population obviously represents a significant share of the Black, Indigenous, and people of color community. However, every category of people identifying as BIPOC is projected to grow over the next decade and or 2 decades, while the white non-Hispanic population is projected to stabilize and or slightly decrease. So how do we continue to provide housing solutions for everybody equitably living in the community? Next slide. Another housing challenge is across the state, not just the Northwest region, but the aging population. So population age 65 and older, and making sure that we have adequate housing supply for an aging population, whether that be aging in place and keeping people in their homes, or providing additional housing supports, senior housing opportunities, in order to maintain a high quality of life as we age. Next slide. So this slide really represents statewide level data. This is provided by Wilder Research, and it is somewhat dated from 2018. They've postponed due to COVID the homeless study that Wilder conducts every 3 years. But really, in 2015 study, we saw a decline in people experiencing homelessness, but then we saw that increase in 2018. And we know that the pandemic didn't help people experiencing homelessness. It was quite the opposite. But some of the trends that we can take pre-pandemic was that the BIPOC community or communities of color are disproportionately represented in people experiencing homelessness. The American Indian population represents about 12% of those in the homelessness study adult population, but represent 1% of Minnesota's population. And we see that across any of the major race ethnicity categories, is that it's just proportionally affecting our BIPOC communities in Minnesota. Another trend that we started to see was that the share of adults age 55 and older also saw an increase in the share that it makes up that are experiencing homelessness. What sort of housing solutions, opportunities can we do to provide housing supports for people experiencing homelessness? Next slide. It's kind of shifting gears. I wanted to provide, I realize I'm flying through a bunch of information, and I can, hopefully you guys can get some of this information later on. But I want to provide some just kind of basic demographics of the community in Northwest as we see them at a high level. So over 80% of the housing stock, whether that be single family homeowners or multifamily, that housing stock was built before 2000. So the need to preserve and or rehab housing stock that exists. I realize that many communities might have its housing stock much older than 2000 and a large share of its housing stock built before 2000. And then as we get into share of households that are cost burdened, so 30% of their income or more is spent on their housing, whether that be their mortgage and utilities or their rent. 18% of homeowners in that 12 county Northwest region are cost burdened, while 46% of renters are cost burdened. So nearly half of all renters in the region are cost burdened. The median rent, this was from the 2019 American Community Survey, was $679. That, according to some CoStar and access to some other data that I have, it's probably much more in like the upper 700 range for the Northwest region. But I wanted to go with similar data source and that I'm most confident in. Median household income for all households in the region is about $57,000 household income. This again is 2019, but median renter household income is much lower. It varies from county to county in the region. Some being on the lower end of nearly $20,000 median renter household income, and some of the higher end being $27,000. There is a question in the chat, is that 679 for 1 or 2 bedroom? That's for all unit sizes in the region. So whether that be 1, 2, they're just taking rents for all units. And as I kind of, the next few slides will kind of concentrate on jobs, job growth, and the impact that that has on communities in the region. So next slide, we'll kind of look at cost of living and wages in the area. Jared, if you want to go to the next slide, please. So this is a table that Minnesota Deed creates of basic costs for a particular household, and whether it's 2 parents, 1 child, a single parent with 1 child, and what are the wages needed for cost of living. And this again is basic housing costs, not necessarily if, hey, I want to go on vacation, what increasing those costs. This is just for those basic needs. And as you can see by the tool, it really is showing, so a 2-parent, 1-child household, the yearly cost of living is over $46,000. So if you start to look at median household income, this even in a region such as Northwest, which has comparative to the state of Minnesota, lower cost of living, that's still putting a pressure on a large share of households in the region. And we know that inflation costs are increasing it with the pandemic. So this data is 2020. So these numbers don't look better today than they did in 2020. Next slide. This is showing workforce housing communities that Minnesota Housing has identified as either seeing job growth or has a large share of their workforce that are traveling 30+ miles into a particular community for work. So Minnesota Housing's identified Bemidji, Park Rapids, Thief River Falls as having job growth. Again, this is 2015 to 2019. So again, it's a little bit dated data, but kind of represents some of the communities really driving household growth in a particular region. East Grand Forks, Crookston, Roseville, Warroad, while maybe haven't seen the particular job growth, they do have a large share of their workforce that travels into those communities for work. So this raises a question for Minnesota Housing of, is there a need in those communities? Are people driving because there isn't the housing available, or is it a particular preference and choice for people that work in those communities? Next slide. The most recent unemployment rate that DEED has put out for the region. It's kind of interesting in Northwest Minnesota. You have Clearwater and Monoman County have some of the highest unemployment rates in the state currently. But overall, the unemployment rate in the region is low. And across the state, the unemployment rate currently is low. So I just wanted to highlight that the job strength and jobs really driving the need for housing in these particular communities. Next slide. Looking over time, so this is building permits being tracked by HUD. So this would be new units added since 2000 in Northwest Minnesota. And as you can see, kind of the ebb and flow over time. So in the early 2000s, the region was adding up to just over 600 total units, a lot of which were single family homes with some, kind of spikes in multifamily unit. We did see in kind of the from 2014 to 2018-19, some additional multifamily units in the region. And I added Beltrami County in there because that spike, I wanted to see where in the region was that spike in the multifamily unit. Was it a particular community? And a lot of that was in Beltrami County. So Bemidji area likely being the large driver for that added units during that particular time. Next slide. So this is looking at CoStar, which is a commercial data database that Minnesota Housing has access to, looking at rental vacancy in the 12-county region over time. So as we saw since 2012 to 2020, early 2021, the rental vacancy steadily kind of dip, still above the 5% range. And then the latest 2022, we've kind of seen it stabilize, it looks like, across the entire region, just above that kind of 5.5% range. Again, this is looking at over the 12 counties. This represents about 54 properties across the 12 counties and nearly 1,700 units. So it's not in totality representation of all vacancy, and it is just multifamily units. So it doesn't take into account single family rental and or that kind of 1 to 3 unit, which might represent a pretty large share of rental in Northwest Minnesota. Next slide. Finally, I kind of want to end looking at home ownership. So this is taking data from the Minnesota Association of Realtors, and they provided this data at, they have 2 particular regions that make up this 12 county region that I was looking at today. The Northwest region is really kind of the Kitson, the border counties. And we really see the median sales price increased nearly 22% from 2020 December to 2021. So pretty huge increase. And then the other number I want to really highlight is the month's supply of inventory. In 2020 in December, it was 3 months supply, so relatively healthy. In December of 2021, it was just over a month supply of inventory. So really limited opportunities for homeowners and putting pressure on that opportunity. And then finally, the headwaters region. So this representing, what is it, Lake of the Woods, Beltrami, Hubbard County. We see higher median sales prices at over $200,000 median sales price, but similar trends, really limited supply of inventory out there and limited supply of homeownership opportunities in the area. So in an area that has high homeownership rate, good job growth, steady job growth, really limited opportunities, putting pressure on all the housing in the area. If there's not opportunity for home ownership, what are the rental opportunities? Well, the rental opportunities in a particular community are affected by this. So it just trickles down into your workforce and your ability to recruit into your particular community to support your workforce. So that was a lot of information really fast, and I tried to keep it as high level as possible. If you have any questions, comments, again, I'm interested in hearing today more at the local level. What you all are seeing in your particular communities, as you know, to look statewide, even region-wide. I realize that the issues occurring in Ada versus Bemidji are completely different. So I really get interested in hearing those things. So I'm interested in hearing in the breakouts today what you all are seeing. So
Thanks, Cody. Thanks. That was great, and really does highlight the need for housing for the workforce and more home ownership opportunities and much more. Cody, there were a couple of questions that you might just look in the chat, and you can even respond in the chat if you want to everybody. And then I think, Cody, you'll be able to be here throughout the morning in the breakouts and so forth, to participate in the conversation. So people will have other opportunities to chat with Cody. So thanks again, Cody. Just to try to catch up a little bit on our time, we're going to move into panel number 1. And this is the panel on setting the stage, racial equity, and the housing needs of our diverse communities. And our facilitator for this panel is Corey Boucher, and he is the program officer for community impact at Northwest Minnesota Foundation. And Corey will introduce the panelists on this panel. So Corey, it's all yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Warren. So hi, everyone. I'm honored to have been asked to facilitate this important panel discussion for the Northwest region this morning. Just want to thank everyone for their interest in housing needs in diverse communities to being in the panel, and definitely heard a lot today about the COVID-19 pandemic shifting the landscape around housing a little bit, and we're going to hear some ways that may have been positive and maybe some challenges, and we'll hear from our panelists today, around those experiences and their ideas for the future. So we did have some cancellations today. So at this time, I'm going to ask if Michelle Landsberg would introduce herself as one of our panelists.
Well, good morning, everyone. And I'd like to just thank all the sponsors and the organizers of this event, this forum. It's a very important conversation, and I'm honored to be a part of it. Landsberg and Associates is a private for-profit company. The last several years, I've worked with economic development in communities of Fosston and Thief River Falls. Also, I've served for many years on the board of directors for Greater Minnesota Management. That's an organization that manages multifamily apartment properties in Northwest Minnesota, about 22 communities. So pretty broad ranging, all the way from Roseau, Baudette to Ada and Park Rapids. For today's conversation, I will be speaking from my own perspective and my own work, as well as a board member of that organization.
Thank you, Michelle. And Jennifer Greenleaf, would you like to introduce yourself as a panelist?
Yep, I'm a little froggy this morning, so I'm Jennifer Greenleaf. I'm the Family Services Manager at the Northwest Indian Community Development Center. Yeah, we serve the community. We serve the whole community, not just Indigenous people. But I guess with that, the understanding is anybody who comes into our organization would have to understand that we have an emphasis on the Anishinaabe way of life. And we serve families with a focus on the whole family. We have workforce development and services for re-entry and jail diversion.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I see there is a couple of phone numbers, so maybe I'll just do a really quick check to see if Abdur Sarak is on one of the phone numbers. He can join if we keep going, but we can move into panel one then. So so just thinking through this, starting our discussion. You on the first part of this, you did highlight some of the things in your guys's introductions, but if we could think about starting off describing, how your organization intersects with the housing needs of diverse communities, and then really thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic and how has that changed the ability for your diverse populations to access housing based on your work, and has the pandemic changed the work of your organization in response? Are the things that we're looking to hear about. And why don't we just start with Michelle?
Okay, well, as we all know, COVID was more than a health crisis. It was also an economic crisis with cascading effects that seem to flow into every part of our work and our lives, and certainly our housing. What I have observed and Greater Minnesota Management and the Northwest Minnesota Multi-County HRA, and again, presence in more than 22 communities in the region. Property maintenance and rehab were very difficult during COVID. Staff had to be very careful about entering buildings and apartments, especially where there were vulnerable older adults. Rehab projects ran into all sorts of roadblocks. As we all know, material costs went through the roof. They still have not come down. There were major supply chain disruptions and a lack of contractors to do the work. It often took 6 months to get something done that might normally have taken a few weeks. And of course, tenants were all impacted by this as well. The eviction moratorium was challenging. There were a handful of properties where residents, engaged in dangerous or damaging activities. Those properties were put at financial risk, and there was danger to other residents. So the eviction moratorium did make those situations challenging. The fourth challenge was the stress and exhaustion among housing management staff. As I think we all know, stress was huge during COVID, and managing housing, even at the best of times, is a rather stressful field. So COVID made those jobs even more stressful, and we did see more employee turnover as a result of that. I really, in my work, don't have any experience with homelessness issue, but in terms of rent burden, I'll just address that a little bit. That's a tough question. I don't think it's increased as a direct result of COVID. With the onset of the pandemic and in the ensuing months, we did not see a decrease in the number of jobs available in our region. We saw employers retaining jobs, primarily, generally speaking. And the only real exception was in the hospitality industry, but there were state programs that helped to retrain people for other career tracks. So that was a good thing. And some of the individuals that lost their employment for time, the unemployment benefits that were provided did really help to mitigate some of that loss in salary and wages. So the larger impact we're really seeing is the number of open positions that our employers are trying to fill because people stepped away from work. What I've seen in generally speaking, if someone wants to work, there is a job for them. Now, because also the labor market is so very tight, we do see employers raising wages. So of course, this does have an impact on rent burden. So wages are being raised and many are offering sign-on bonuses. It's a very competitive job market right now. So that has sort of helped to reduce the rent burden, but the other factor that is still impacting things is the rising cost of inflation. So that's a moving target, and I don't think it's not landed yet. So that too kind of is factoring into this rent burden and maybe impacting it in a negative way. Corey, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, those are some great themes to start to be thinking about. Jennifer, how about you? What are your thoughts on these questions? Jennifer, I apologize. Oh, there you go.
There we go. I hadn't really been in a housing role before the pandemic hit, but I don't know if everybody's familiar with Talia Palmer. She was our former executive director, and she was always a very generous woman and wanted to take care of our community. And we got some COVID money, and we knew that we needed to put up our homeless people because everybody was, quarantining, everybody was panicking at the beginning of the pandemic, and we had to help our homeless. And so we started putting people up at Best Western, and she put me in charge of that. And it soon turned into, we were having 15 to 20 people or even families at Best Western. And then we had to develop a program of like, how do we hold these people accountable? Because pretty soon we were starting to get damages, and people were taking advantage of the generosity that the NWICDC was extending to them. So we started making it that they had to meet with us 2 times a week to show us some sort of measurable progress. And we were making sure that everybody was going through a MNsure application, SNAP. They were meeting with Recovery Corps, which was, if they had substance abuse or alcoholism, and then making sure that they were doing job applications and housing applications, and just trying to be really proactive to help them become more self-sustainable. It didn't really work for, probably 70% of the people, but we had some really good successes out of there. Even one of the gals works here now, so it was pretty cool. We had, I think 3 families get housing out of there, and some of these families were pretty hard to place. So we're kind of working that into the way that we operate now, is that it's kind of our standard operating procedures to make sure that, we're getting employment in place, that we're getting stable housing, and we want measurable progress so that, people aren't just being stagnant. And sometimes, that takes a really supportive, gentle hand, because a lot of our members are in trauma. And that goes, with our generational trauma, the historical trauma. And I'm not sure how much everybody here knows about that, but for the Indigenous people, that's a really deep wound that many of us are walking with every day. So I think that's probably one of our biggest challenges, is because not everybody in the community knows that we walk with this burden every day. So I guess that's about it.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, I appreciate the highlight of the almost a positive of the pandemic, of the new funding that's available that allowed you to, change things up a little bit, and all that you learned from that. Moving on to our next question then, for the two of you. I'll see. Yep. Thank you, Jeremy. So what grassroots, grass tops examples have you seen that have worked, and what recommendations would you make for future actors, which will advance racial equity and inclusion? So I had to ask this question, so I'll say it for the group. Grassroots meaning some more like funders, community organizations. Many of you guys come from grassroots organizations, and grass tops meaning that elected officials, legislation, things like that. So yeah, why don't we just start with Michelle again?
All right, well, thanks, Corey. I'm going to start with the recommendations and then move to the examples at the end. The top recommendation that I would have, and it's just so basic. I'm sure everybody that's part of this session today would agree. We need to retain our existing housing stock, and we need to create more housing of all kinds. We simply need more housing units. We are short. Northwest Minnesota is extremely rural, and there are many small and remote communities, but these are communities where people want to live. They are communities where there is economic opportunity. Employers are creating jobs and want to retain jobs. They're trying to fill open positions, and these employers are in a critical situation. We're hearing over and over again that they can't fill jobs because people can't find a place to live. And that's because there just is not enough housing capacity. We're not trying to keep people out. We are trying to get people in. We want to house people, and that's people of every race and income level. But we can't do that if we don't have enough housing units or housing units that people qualify for. So we need to look at both sides of that equation. That's the first step, and that's the largest issue I'm seeing in my work in Northwest Minnesota. We need more workforce housing and more housing of every kind overall. So how do we fix that? Well, last year, I worked on an in-depth strategic plan for Greater Minnesota management. And as part of that plan, I talked to housing stakeholders from across the region. And one of the priority items that came out during those interviews was the need for a go-to person for housing projects. Someone that has the expertise to help small communities figure out how to do a housing project, how to pay for it, how to quantify the need and the type of housing needed. That expertise is missing. At least it's not something that communities are aware of or able to tap into in a meaningful way. Many communities want to do something. They know they need more housing, but it's difficult and complicated. And on the community level, it's hard to pull those pieces together. So a go-to person that could help communities would be extremely helpful, kind of a one-stop shop. We also need developers that are willing to take a risk in smaller communities. And I'm going to point to the Workforce Housing Development Program that's administered by Minnesota Housing Finance. That's an extremely helpful program. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of funding. We'd love to see more funding for that program. Just this last year, well, just this month, the city of Austin applied for funding for that program. We are keeping our fingers crossed, but again, we know the funding is limited and it's very competitive, but we've had a property that's been languishing. It's been empty for 6 years. It was a former grocery store. Always the plan was that this would be redeveloped into apartments, but we just could not get a developer that would take the risk on redeveloping this property. But just now, these last few weeks, reached out to a developer and said, hey, if we can get this grant, would this make the difference for you? And he said, yes, I would be willing to take the risk if we can get some grant dollars through this program. So we're hoping that we can make that happen. But more money for that program, I think, would be very helpful. It would help to mitigate some of that risk for developers and help them to have the confidence to move forward in some of these smaller rural communities. Last but not least, we need to figure out how to better serve people that we might call hard to house. The phrase continuum of housing, I first heard that from Warren Hansen when he came up to Thief River Falls a few years ago. We had a meeting at DigiKey, and I really liked that phrase. We need a continuum of housing, multiple options and ways for people to get into and pay for a home. In the career world, we talk about career pathways. And I think we need to think in those same terms with housing. We need to think about housing pathways. How do we get people to the place where they can get into a home, build their credit, get to the place where they can, pass a background check, where they can be financially stable and all of those things, and maybe eventually even own their own single family home. It's not just one thing that will help. We need more education, more support, better communication between agencies and organizations and landlords. When I did the strategic plan last year, one of the ideas that came out, and I really liked this, was creating an indemnity fund for potential tenants who can't pass a background check. So that would be a pool of money that landlords can look at and say, okay, I'll take a chance on this resident, even though they might not pass that background check. Then if needed, that money could be accessed to make that property whole. The program has been successful, at least in one community here in Northwest Minnesota, but you have to build relationships, especially with the mom and pop landlords. So I've taken my share of time. I'll hand it back to you, Corey.
Thank you, Michelle. Jennifer, do you have anything you want to add to this question?
Yeah, one of my things has been, I've really been thinking about, where our low-income housing is and how it just seems like it fosters so much crime, and it's not always fair to the people who are trying to live a good life, but they can't afford to move somewhere else. So I feel like there should be options, like a fourplex somewhere for families, in different parts of town, for, to have different options rather than living in these large apartment complexes where it just seems like everybody's thrown together. And I feel like our families would have a much better chance with their kids, because I don't know if anybody around here has been exposed to Bemidji's low-income places, but it's shocking how some of these kids are just not even affected by what's going on around them. And then they're going to grow up and be just like the people who are, causing the trouble. And it's like we're just continuing the problem where, we're not helping it. But that's just, one of my dreams maybe. But, second too is for some of these funders and elected officials to tour some of the houses that we have our families, and even for the youth, the YHDP, for them to walk through there. Like, would you put your child, your 18, 19-year-old in there? Because I admitted to myself, I wouldn't put my kids in there, but I'm actually putting kids in these places because that's the best we can do, which is really sad. And we just need to do better for these kids. And I don't know if the landlords are just getting away with this. I just don't know how to hold them accountable to be doing better. But this is the bottom of the barrel housing that we are left with because there's nothing left to pick from. And a lot of them are hard to place. They don't understand the credit, and they barely have co-signers because they barely have adults in their life that have credit. So it's just a trickle down effect of, frustration. And they're just left to couch hop because they cannot get into these places. And it's just a whole circle of frustration. And then I just wanted to bring up too is, we see it with the indigenous people's names. Kingbird is as common as Johnson. I know for a fact that if some landlords, not all landlords, are tossing applications out when they see an indigenous name. And so our indigenous people aren't even getting a fair shot. So how do we make sure that they're getting a fair shot? Because we can make fair turnarounds. I'm living proof that that can be done. 15 years ago, I had my children taken away because I was an alcoholic in a domestic violent relationship. And here I am today doing this. So everyone can, make that turnaround. But if people aren't going to give, another person a chance, how do you get a chance? And my last name is Greenleaf. My kids' last names are Wind. Those, they don't scream indigenous, but they have a loud yell. So those are the things, that we're kind of just asking for equality in. I should stop before I get emotional.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for sharing all of that. That was kind of our last question. So I'll just do maybe a really brief recap if that's, or Warren, were you going to do that? I see you coming up.
No, please go ahead.
Okay. So, I mean, just some things that I really pulled out of the conversation today was just, and I tried to quickly put it all together, but just retaining housing and that property maintenance. Some of our places we're seeing that low income housing that's not maintained becomes the affordable place for families and families that are unfair situations looking to do better. That eviction moratorium also created some challenge there with people not being able to be evicted that were causing problems for other families. There's just a lack of contractors and developers in our communities to do the work of maintaining housing or building new housing, and a lack of capital for those developers to take on the risk, or maybe a need for more capital is a better way to put it. There's a need for all types of new housing, a continuum of housing. So being able to affordably rent and move all the way to home ownership with dignified places to live. So not just affordable housing, but places that that everyone should have a safe and fair shot at living in. Elected officials would really gain a lot, or funders, or many of us would gain a lot by touring some of these places that the families and people are having to live in. And that we're just seeing racism is still deeply rooted in our housing system and impacting people's opportunity. And that's just something that we really need to keep working on as we continue to build more affordable housing and create opportunity for people. So thank you both so much for your participation and letting me facilitate this conversation.
Thanks, Corey and Jennifer and Michelle. We are scheduled to have a brief breakout session. We're going to tighten it up just a little bit. It was scheduled for 15 minutes. We're going to take 10 minutes now and go into a breakout session. So you'll be in a breakout session kind of automatically assigned to a small group of 7 or 8 people. And what we'd like you to do, and if somebody would take notes and then share them back with us, that would be great. But we just want you to kind of react a little bit to what you've heard, you know, what the issues are, and in particular to discuss the equity and inclusion issues that you see as the most vexing or challenging in your community. And on the positive note, as was kind of alluded to, are there particular initiatives that are occurring that are the most beneficial, maybe replicable, or that could be expanded? So if with those 2 ideas, if you would just spend the next 10 minutes talking to some of your colleagues, we'll be back in the large group in just 10 minutes. Well, we are back in session and with the large group. And thanks for doing that breakout session. We had a great brief conversation. And I'll just share with you that one of the takeaways that came up in our small group discussion about diversity and equity and inclusion was that services can make all the difference in the world, even in the older projects. This doesn't mean that, you know, they might not need rehab or improved conditions, but that housing is kind of half the equation for some of our community members, and a little support goes a long way to improving their stability and improving their other life outcomes. Right now, we're going to talk about housing policy and housing resources, and that would be Elizabeth Glidden.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Glidden. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of Minnesota Housing Partnership. We are a 30-plus year nonprofit that works in the areas of policy and advocacy, producing original research, and supporting rural communities and Native nations with community development. And I think you all have my slides. So if someone would move those forward for me, the next one, please. So advocacy, we are getting ready for the 2022 legislative session. And I'll hold back on a couple details here because I was expecting Dan to kind of give the nuts and bolts overview, but session starts January 31st. And at Minnesota Housing Partnership, we often start our presentations on policy and advocacy with a light grounding in data. I've kind of held back on some of our data, just knowing that we have a short amount of time together, but here are 2 slides that we commonly use as we're trying to lay the foundation for what is our ask in the legislative session. And so on the left-hand side, you're seeing this graph that really tells the story about our housing shortage that affects the Northwest region, but also the entire state of Minnesota. And it's a shortage that was created back in the Great Recession when housing production became very limited and we never regained what we needed. On the right-hand side, we see a little bit of a snapshot of what is getting produced in terms of units and what income levels do they serve, and what should that distribution be. And so you can see from here, and this is really due to what is the availability of different types of housing finance tools, that are mismatch is between demand and supply. And just a note too that these system strains are exacerbating racial disparities throughout the state, and cost burden, home ownership, and others. And our failure to address these issues will be perpetuating the structural racism in our housing system. Next slide. So this session is unique, probably for many reasons, but one that I will mention is that we have a historic surplus this year of what is now announced as $7.7 billion. And there are different theories within our legislative bodies on what to do with that surplus. And so we'll see those dynamics playing out over the session. I think from the Senate side, you will see more themes of how do we reduce taxes and reduce cost. And on the House side, I think we'll see themes that are more about investment. However, this lays the groundwork for what is an advocate's ask during the legislative session. And with this historic surplus and matching up to what we know is tremendous need and really a backlog of need, what we have is a big ask, as you can see here. And Minnesota Housing, the agency, they use the phrase "go big so that we can all go home." And I think you're going to see advocates really leaning into that as an important message for this session in particular. So here we are seeing $2 billion in housing investments, which would be less than 2% of the state budget, being the big and bold ask for this session. And that is divided between $1 billion that would be more for that new housing construction, as well as preservation. So talking about all the different types of building and preserving home programs. And then a $1 billion that is identified in access and opportunity, rental assistance being a big piece of that, but homeownership counseling, down payment assistance also. So just a little side note on what that includes. This is a bonding year. And so advocates are making a big ask for bonds for housing. That $500 million that you see there is divided between $100 million in GO bonds, which would be for public housing, and $400 million that would be for housing infrastructure bonds. The state will also need to make decisions through the legislature on how to allocate a large chunk of the American Rescue Plan fiscal recovery funds that went to the state. And a few other items of note, maybe last one I will highlight for you, which is that we are again going to be asking for a local housing trust fund state match to get to what we had anticipated was a full 10 million. So we got allocated 1 million last year, and we would be asking for the remainder of that to meet the great need that we are seeing from communities anxious for local housing trust fund state match. Next slide. So just a really high level mention of federal advocacy, because I feel like we are hearing even more than ever about the federal government's role in housing. One item that's not on here, again, is this American Rescue Plan that I just mentioned on the previous slide. The American Rescue Plan fiscal recovery funds also affect local government. Local governments have received allocations, and those funds can be designated for housing. Most local governments have not made their full designations of the American Rescue Plan dollars. And I'm going to put into the chat in a little bit a link to a webinar Minnesota Housing Partnership produced on how those funds could be designated for housing. Build Back Better is the big bill that we're kind of hearing a lot about in the news that seems like it's maybe on some shaky ground right now, but it's important to note that this would have some of the most important investments from the federal government in generations into housing. And finally, just of note, we still do not have appropriations confirmed for fiscal year 22. There even is some discussion of a continuing resolution that could last for an entire year. If that happened, that would mean that housing programs would be held to 2021 funding levels, which would be an effective cut. So right now, in fact, is a good time to be reaching out to your member of Congress to say that you support moving forward with fiscal year 2022 appropriations and ensuring that housing is reflected in there. Next slide. So I'm going to go through these next two quickly because we need to move on to our next speaker, I know, but there's always I know there's a Q&A after this. So I'm going to highlight two programs that were approved by the state legislature and signed by the governor in the 2021 session. First is a local housing fund state match program. Minnesota Housing Partnership has worked to support development of local housing trust funds. We've developed a manual for Minnesota jurisdictions, developed through our community development department, provided TA. And this is our legislative ask for state match fund. And this was approved at the $1 million level last year. We're still waiting for Minnesota Housing to finalize an application procedure, but this will be rolling out this year. Next slide. And last, this is a really substantial new program that was approved by the Minnesota legislature and signed by the governor in the 2021 session. Minnesota Housing Partnership had worked with many housing organizations throughout the state on this over a course of 3+ years. And so we're very excited to see this program approved. As of right now, it is a limited term program that will be in place for 6 years at $10 million a year or for $60 million total. This is a program that was based on a North Dakota model of an affordable housing tax credit that allows taxpayers, which can be community banks, businesses, and individuals, to make donations and then receive a credit on their outstanding tax liability. And that's how the program is capitalized. This year, 2022, will be a year to work with Minnesota Housing on what will be the implementation and the regulations governing this program so that then it can roll out. We are very excited about this in part because it is a fantastic public-private partnership about how to leverage support from your entire community for affordable housing programs, and is one of the most substantial new programs approved by the Minnesota legislature in many, many years. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to my colleague from MHP, Sarah Belfuel.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for providing an overview of MHP's policy work and 2022 legislative session and our national work. I'm just going to take a minute or two just to talk about the community development department resources at MHP. Our department includes 8 staff members that provide technical assistance in Minnesota and nationally through funding from HUD and USDA. We provide technical assistance through 3 programs, including our Strengthening Rural Communities program, MHP's Housing Institute and Native Community Development Institute, which some of you on the Zoom meeting today may have participated in previously, and MHP's Emerging Developers Initiative, which is a new program focused on increasing developer capacity in Northwest Minnesota. Can you change the slide, please? First off, one of MHP's main resources is our Strengthening Rural Communities program. This is a capacity building program specifically for rural areas and Native nations. The process includes an online application and review process to determine applicant eligibility prior to technical assistance being awarded. If the application is approved, then the applicant will receive technical assistance for anywhere from 1 to 3 years, depending on project goals. In addition, technical assistance recipients have access to limited financial assistance, including grant funds and pre-development loan funds. Can you change the slide, please? Thank you. I would also like to announce a new pilot program that is focused in the Northwest region of Minnesota, MHP's Emerging Developers Initiative, which grew out of discussions with Northwest Minnesota Foundation on the need to expand and diversify the pool of developers in Northwest Minnesota. The Northwest Minnesota Foundation, as well as GMHF and Otto Bremer Foundation, are supporting this program, which has 3 components. These include research and resource creation, which includes asset development and mapping, community engagement, establishing relationships with emerging developers of color and Native nations, and housing research specific to Northwest Minnesota, including a recently completed Northwest Minnesota regional profile. And we should be putting a link in that in the chat pretty quick here. MHP's Emerging Developer Initiative is also looking to increase developer capacity through educational outreach and support. And finally, MHP's Emerging Developer Initiative will include local workshops that will provide opportunities for potential developers, funders, and local communities to network with goals for increasing diversity within the development field and ultimately increasing housing in the Northwest region. I know time is limited, so I want to turn the Zoom mic back to the presenter.
And Mike Monson from USDA RD is here to give us some updates on RD's programs and resources. Thanks, Mike.
Yep. Good morning, everybody. As Warren said, I'm Mike Munson. I'm the Single Family Housing Program Director for USDA Rural Development. And most of you probably know, but for those that don't, USDA Rural Development is really a mission area comprised of 3 agencies. The Rural Utility Service, Rural Housing Service, and Rural Business Service. But our mission is to assist rural communities in creating prosperity so they are self-sustaining and not economically thriving through investments that create ladders of opportunity, build regional resilience, and support the growth of emerging markets. So that's quite a mouthful. We do that in providing over 40 programs throughout the 3 agencies that I talked about earlier. So you can go to the next slide, Jeremy. At the national level, as I said, the programs are delivered through 3 agencies. The Rural Business Service is just all about job creation, business creation, job retention, business creation. It also houses the REAP program, which is the Rural Energy for America program, which involves renewable and energy efficiency programs. The Rural Housing Service administers both the single family housing program, loan and grants through both a direct program and a guaranteed program. On the direct side, those are geared towards low and very low income recipients, and more on the guaranteed side is more of the moderate income folks in the rural parts of our state. Most counties are eligible for both programs except that ring around the metropolitan area. There is a site available on our website that allows you to go in and check income and location eligibility. Some things happening in the direct side. We're continuing to try to grow our partnership with Southwest Minnesota Housing in the packaging area. They are our approved intermediary for Minnesota. They actually do some packaging for us through some other folks. West Central Minnesota Housing is on board, MMCDC, and a couple others out of Wisconsin that do some work in Southeast Minnesota. So we're looking at extending and expanding that relationship. Also trying to get some folks on board on the repair program in the 504 area to help package loans. Guaranteed program, as I said, is out there, very popular with the commercial lending community. Elizabeth talked about funding a little bit. Yes, we are on a continuing resolution through February 18th. We don't really have any news other than that, which reverts us back to the 21 funding levels, which means about $1 billion nationwide in single family housing direct and about 30 million in 504 loan and 504 grant funds available. What that means for Minnesota, we usually spend between 15 and $20 million on our direct housing program, and about $1 million in our 504 repair program. And the guaranteed side, funding would be maintained at about 24 billion nationwide. And Minnesota continues to spend roughly $400 to $500 million in USDA guaranteed loans on the direct home ownership program. Within the rural housing service, also we have the multifamily housing program, which we've got approximately 475 projects scattered throughout the state of Minnesota, roughly 10,000, 11,000 units or thereabouts. And also the community facility program, which includes such things as healthcare, libraries, fire protection, police protection, daycare, those type of things that are essential to a town or community. And just a note on the American Rescue Plan, we did receive a little bit of money on the direct side through 2023 to help our existing borrowers that were on a COVID moratorium. And we're working through that program right now. It's had some challenges in getting that money back and refinancing our existing borrowers' loans, but that is one thing that we are doing in the area of trying to keep people in their houses on the direct side. So you can go to the next slide, Jeremy. And then just a little bit on our structure. So you know how we're organized. There's 4 regions in the country, 47 state directors, about 400 area offices. In Minnesota, we have 11 offices scattered throughout the state, including Thief River, Detroit Lakes, Bemidji, Virginia, Baxter, that would be that northern part of the state, and then Cambridge, Alex, Wilmer, Marshall, Worthington, and Faribault. And we're overseen by a state director that's politically appointed. They have not been appointed yet in Minnesota. There's been about half of the state directors appointed so far in Minnesota. And I just noticed a couple people from our staff on the call today, so I want to recognize them, and that's Dana Roshnet and Michelle Wycliffe from our offices. So that's a brief overview of USDA rural development, and I'll turn it back.
We are going to have a little bit of an overview of a new program at Greater Minnesota Housing Fund called the Emerging Developers of Color Program, that is going to work throughout Greater Minnesota statewide, but also emphasizing Greater Minnesota. And I'll turn it over to Irene, who's the new program officer at Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, directing this program. Thanks, Irene.
Thanks, Warren. Good morning, everyone. My name is Irene Ruiz-Briceño, and I'm the program officer for GMHF's Emerging Developer of Color program. This program was just launched in the fall of 2021, and it aims to increase the number of developers, landlords, entrepreneurs, small business owners that are engaged in affordable housing development. So why is this important? Because affordable housing developers of color are underrepresented and often lack access to and networks within the affordable housing industry. So Greater Minnesota Housing Fund wants to support those individuals and organizations led by people of color in their growth as affordable housing developers. So if you are a developer, you want to become a developer, you know of developers in your community that are looking to do an acquisition project, a rehab, or a new construction project, they should contact us about technical assistance, flexible financing options for their project, training resources, pre-development financing, and grant funding opportunities. You can advance the slide. And so I just want to highlight this, this last bullet, the grant funding opportunities. We are excited to have some grant funds available for developers of color. Funds can be used to advance affordable housing projects or receive training in affordable housing development. Additional information, a link to the application and instructions on how to apply is posted on our website. So feel free to please share this opportunity and my contact information widely within your networks. Next slide.
The link is actually in the chat as well.
Excellent. In addition to working directly with developers, GMHF also seeks to work in partnership with other organizations who are supporting emerging developers. So this could mean aligning with existing programs, increasing efficiency, impact, and effectiveness of programs, leveraging each other's efforts, strengths, and resources so that we make a greater impact, and successfully advancing common objectives, as well as tapping into your local expertise. So an example that I've seen of successful partnership model includes a larger developer partnering with an emerging developer or a contractor who is making that leap into doing development on their own to provide mentorship and support as they navigate that big learning curve of becoming a developer and doing a project. Next slide. Our vision is that through this program, GMHF can have a positive influence on driving changes in the industry, such as increasing the racial diversity and reducing the racial disparities within the affordable housing developer community. The affordable housing market will become more inclusive of developers of color, and more opportunities will be shared with them. Developers of color will build assets, wealth, and income using that as their business model. And developers of color will contribute to the overall goal of producing and preserving affordable homes, which we've heard all morning that Minnesota just desperately needs. And finally, as more developers come to the market that reflect Minnesota's diverse communities, the housing system itself will be better equipped to meet the needs of our diverse communities. Next slide. So the main thing that I would like you to take away from my brief presentation is that we want to hear from you. Whether you are a developer, you want to become a developer, you have an idea for a housing project, or maybe you are an organization whose mission aligns with ours. We want to hear about the projects and the programs. Please feel free to reach out to me directly. I would love to hear about the creative and exciting initiatives that are happening in Northwest Minnesota and talk about opportunities for GMHF to provide support and to collaborate with you. So thanks for letting me share the details of my program.
Thanks, Irene. I had to get myself off mute. We're going to move right on to one more program from Greater Minnesota Housing Fund that Eric Muschler will talk about. And this is our new Housing and Health Equity Initiative. This was started actually, oddly and ironically, in March of 2020. And we had a huge statewide summit, 150 people from healthcare and from the housing field for a whole day. And we had United Health and Blue Cross and everybody that was very much interested in social outcomes due to housing. And so then the pandemic hit. So we've relaunched this program, and it's being led by Eric Muschler, who we were able to recruit from McKnight Foundation to be the director of the program. And Eric will give us a good overview right now of what this initiative will involve, working statewide, and we'll need a lot of help from our partners in Greater Minnesota to advance this agenda of working more with healthcare around housing outcomes. And Eric, it's
Thank you.
yours.
Thank you, Warren. So again, my name is Eric Muschler. I'm the new director of the Housing and Health Equity Initiative at Greater Minnesota Housing Fund. And we really want to lift up and expand the good work that many of you are doing on housing and health equity. Warren mentioned that this did start right before COVID. Well, we're re-jump starting it. And what we know from this point forward is that the world's changed. We've never been more clear about the connections between housing and health. Of course, the other thing that happened within the last 18 months to 2 years was a racial reckoning around the murder of George Floyd. And these two events are really going to shape our work moving forward. The Housing and Health Equity Initiative recognizes that housing, health, and equity go hand in hand in hand. So the connections can push our collective focus and our investments toward upstream solutions to community health and equity through housing. The initiative will be working across the fields of housing and health to identify innovative projects, practice, and sharing them across the state. So there is a ton of research that really demonstrates the connection between housing and health. I know we're short on time, so I'm not going to go into great detail, but there's research that shows improvements in employment, in education of kids, in economic independence and available resources for medicine and food. There's even research connecting neighborhood health stability and safety. We also know that housing and healthcare interests are aligning more and more. So for healthcare, improving health outcomes, lowering healthcare costs, and increasing focus on health disparities. Now for housing, there's a long legacy. We all know the legacy of housing with proven health benefits. Yet homelessness continues to increase, as we heard from Minnesota Housing, and people of color experiencing homelessness at a rate of 17 times that of whites. Given the pandemic and disproportionate impact on Black and Indigenous populations in particular, the housing and health equity links are explicitly clear. So the goals of the initiative are listed here on this next slide. And the initiative is really identifying a pipeline of projects. Next slide, Jer. Yeah, identifying a pipeline of projects, really focusing on engaging the healthcare sector more directly and bridging conversations across networks and communities of practice, collecting the research, sharing best practices, catalyzing further investment, particularly encouraging direct investment in affordable housing from players like the Mayo Clinic, who already is doing so, Sanford Health, who has some examples that we can share, and Essentia, who's also doing some things. So we want to really work with healthcare and move forward this path of direct investment. And of course, identifying and advocating the policy and systems change that will effectively link housing and health will also be collected. So there's many great Minnesota examples of this work to be proud of, including several in the Northwest region, like Park Place of Bemidji, like the 3 phases of Conifer Estates, Conifer Villas, and now East Conifer. We've collected a set of case studies, and we want to collect more and promote successes of groups like Headwaters, like Center City Housing, like Red Lake, like Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, and others. You'll hear more about the types of projects on the 3rd panel today. Now, we want to be partners and allies of yours in engaging the healthcare community. So I'm here to listen and to learn, and I want to know about the challenges, the difficulties, and where you think the strategies are to move these types of projects forward. Next slide. They could be demonstrated successful project, permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, respite housing. These are all some proven housing strategies. But there's also anchor institution development, where when you work on maybe mixed use housing in targeted areas near hospitals or clinics, we want to work with you on those. Other real estate development, mixed use projects with clinics, various developments that support upstream solutions around community health with food, maybe childcare. Those sort of mixed housing projects are things that we really want to advance. And finally, coordinated access to health programming. So fostering increased services for residents, that actually came up today as one of the findings of the first panel, really connecting those. So including the use of Medicaid for stable housing services and upstream health interventions. So really pleased to be here. And GMHF is here to finance your projects, as always, provide technical assistance, and provide equity and debt as necessary to get the job done. So I want to work with John Rocker and you and the lending team to identify new sources of financing and funding from the healthcare sector, and hope you'll reach out to me early and often to share your ideas, the projects that are in the pipeline, the opportunities that link affordable housing, health, and equity. So thanks very much, and I really do look forward to the discussion.
And I'm Dan Kitzberger. I'm the legislative director at Minnesota Housing. I'll be brief, and I don't want to be duplicative of anything Elizabeth already previewed for you. As she mentioned, there is a surplus. It's likely to grow at this point. You know, given where we are with revenue collections, there is one more forecast in February. So that's kind of when the rubber will really hit the road as far as the actual work of the legislature on the budget process. As far as the governor's administration, just now, actually at 11 o'clock, the governor will be rolling out his capital budget recommendations, which will include recommendations for housing infrastructure bonds and for general obligation bonds for public housing. So keep an eye out for that. And then we will be releasing the governor's budget recommendations for Minnesota housing later this week on Thursday, and then next week, kind of in a few distinct parts. Expect the recommendations for housing to come on the last day, which, if my memory serves me, is the 26th. Again, it's still a little bit of a while the recommendations are finalized, there's always this mad rush at the end to roll things out in a way that's memorable and compelling. Yep, we'll be the budget recommendations for housing will be coming out next week on the 26th. So keep an eye out for those. You know, we just as far as being able to kind of preview or tease what you'll be hearing. You know, given the state's historic surplus, we have, you know, some historic opportunities to really make some progress. You know, there's a large amount of federal funds that are still needing to be spent, and the legislature and the governor will negotiate those. But you know, given how much money there is on the bottom line at the state level, we have some really good opportunities to grow agency programs. I'm sure you've all heard that we're 0.3% of the state's budget, general fund budget, and so we have a really unique opportunity, and I would argue a generational opportunity to make some big investments in those programs, and have them be base funding, so it's ongoing. So you know, I hope there will be excitement. I hope advocates and practitioners around the state will continue to push us and push the administration and push the legislature to go further and to do and to build on the very good work that we and our and all of you, our community partners, are already doing.
We are going to have a breakout session right now, just to build on what Dan just mentioned and what our other speakers talked about. Room 1 is the Minnesota Housing Qualified Action Plan, or QAP. And so everything you want to know about the QAP, the new QAP, the QAP guidelines. Room 2 will be single family housing. And room 3, multifamily housing. Room 4 will be GMHF's new Emerging Developer of Color program with Irene. And room 5 will be GMHF's new Housing and Health Equity program with Eric Muschler. So feel free to pick a room. We're going to cut the time down a little bit. It was going to be 30 minutes. We're going to have to cut that to 15. But take the next 15 minutes, ask as many questions as you can, and join the room of your choosing. And Jeremiah, any other directions here in terms of getting into a room?
The rooms are open, and if you don't see them available, you can select on your Zoom taskbar breakout rooms. It might be under the More section with 3 dots. And Sarah Bellafield is here as well for the MHP Emerging Developer Program. So Sarah, if you care to join group number 4 to talk about your program as well.
So you may see breakout rooms on the bottom taskbar there, along with your chat menu item. There's kind of a breakout room list, and they're all listed there. And I can see a large number of people are joining.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. My name is Tim Flathers. I am currently serving as an interim executive director with the Headwaters Regional Development Commission in Bemidji. First, I'd like to say thank you to Greater Minnesota Housing Fund and Minnesota Housing for the opportunity to participate in this forum this morning. And I also want to say thank you to everybody that's made time to be on the call, including the presenters. We've had a lot of great presentations this morning, and it makes it a good investment of time to participate in such a great forum. This is really an important and timely discussion. I just want to provide one tidbit of information. The HRDC recently did a survey of customers and partners throughout our region and asked a fundamental question about what the most important issues are that we need to be addressing in order to create a successful region and successful communities. We heard a variety of responses, including workforce issues, transportation, and childcare. But the issue that was identified more than any other issue in that survey was housing. And I thought that was interesting. And so I'm really thankful that this forum is taking place and that so many people throughout the region and throughout the state are participating. This morning, I have the honor to introduce a panel of 3 individuals who are making a significant difference responding to housing issues in their respective communities. We have a great opportunity this morning to hear a local perspective, a regional perspective, and a statewide perspective on affordable housing issues. I'm going to do a brief introduction of all 3 and then go to each of the presenters. This morning, we will get to hear from Sarah Wilcox, who is a development specialist with the Headwaters Regional Development Commission. I've had the opportunity to work with Sarah over the past 3 years, and she's done all of our single-family development over that time and has also been a person that's been heavily involved in our multifamily development. And she'll talk to you about the Conifer Villas project, but maybe a little bit about the Conifer Villas campus, because we have several projects taking place in the same vicinity. We'll also have you hear from Todd Peterson, who is the Community Development Coordinator from the city of Roseau. Todd is one of the first people I recall talking about the need for workforce housing. This goes back at least a decade before it was such a prevalent issue and before some of the resources to respond to that issue have been made available. So Todd will describe a project that he's involved with the city of Roseau. And finally, Wes Johnson, the program and loan officer with the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund. Wes can share with us a little bit about some of the statewide examples dealing with workforce housing. And it's always great to hear from Greater Minnesota Housing Fund because they're both a funder of some really cool projects throughout the state, but they're also a creative force in the state in helping us address some of the issues that might otherwise go unaddressed. So with that, I would like to ask Sarah to provide a little bit of an overview of the Conifer Villas project, Sarah. And maybe starting out with a little bit of a description of the work that you do and the key project that you'll be discussing today.
Thank you, Tim. So I work at a Headwaters Regional Development Commission. I work in 2 fields, actually. One is with the Public Emergency Communications Group, and the other side of my job would be working in housing in a variety of ways, such as staffing a couple HRAs, an HRDC subsidiary, HHDC. These groups all have boards and have various housing projects that go with them, whether that's single family development, multifamily, purchase, rehab, resale. It could be rental properties. HRDC covers 5 counties. And those would be Lake of the Woods, Beltrami, Monoman, Clearwater, and Hubbard. The project I'll be speaking of more is located in Bemidji, Minnesota. Did you want to go through those questions, Tim, or should I jump into my PowerPoint?
Let me ask a couple questions, Sarah. Can you describe the Conifer project in terms of what the vision for the project is and give a little bit of an overview of the number of units that you're developing?
Sure. The final vision of the project is to provide housing to homeless households with supportive services. At Conifer Estates, there are 20 units. That is in that first picture. Those that are there are Red Lake Housing Authority, Leech Lake Tribe, and BICAP. Phase 2 would be Conifer Villas, it has 32 units. Red Lake Housing Authority also master leases through Conifer Villas. Housing Matters is a service provider, and there's also some Section 8 at that project as well. Phase 3 is East Conifer Estates, there's 24 units there. That's also Red Lake Housing Authority, Housing Matters in Section 8.
So what organization is the developer, and who are the key partners and funders for the project?
The developer would be HRDC's subsidiary, Headwaters Housing Development Corporation, which is a nonprofit. The supportive services really make this project a success. And they're doing an amazing job with the tenants, helping provide them with the tools and resources they need to be successful.
What would you characterize as being the unique or innovative aspects of the project?
I would say the supportive services really is what makes it a successful project. Without them, we couldn't do as well as we are. Our partnerships with the tribes also is very notable. As mentioned before, Red Lake Housing Authority and Leech Lake, that master lease our units out there. Headwaters Housing Development Corporation as our subsidiary and developer. That board is very supportive of the mission of the project and have a really great trusting relationship with staff. Partnerships in general, I think that is the best lesson learned with this project. It really takes a great staff team and people pulling in areas of their expertise. Beltrami County HRA, they help make these projects successful by donating the land. And that's also another board that we staff. Our funders, Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, the Federal Home Loan Bank, Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, also Northwest Minnesota Foundation, they helped out early on as well. Our development consultant, we really could not do that without them. Trusting in their advice, they know all the technical details and they help through the mountains of paperwork that these projects have. Also having a great attorney that goes above and beyond to help us with legal advice as well. Having a great working relationship with the architect and contractor, also with our service providers and property manage things. Looping in all these people as needed and taking the time to have everyone at the table at the beginning of the project really makes a difference.
Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have?
Nothing that I can't think of anything, Tim.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think you're doing such a great job on the projects, and it's really making a significant difference in the region. With that, I would like to introduce you to Todd Peterson, Community Development Coordinator with the City of Roseau. And I guess I'd start with the same general questions, Todd. Can you describe your organization, focus of work, and give a little description of the 1101 project that you'll be discussing today?
Sure. Again, I'm Todd Peterson. I've been the Community Development Coordinator in the City of Roseau for approximately 25 years. So been dealing with workforce housing issues for a long time. And, you know, in the past, we've had, well, we really haven't had any workforce housing constructed for many years. I go back to, it's probably been since the early 90s is the last time a privately developed project was built in our community. And so we've pushed to get, you know, other subsidized housing built, but it wasn't meeting all the needs of our workforce market rate housing. So the vision we had was to put together a pure market rate workforce housing project. And we sought out developers to help us with that. The problem is no developers really wanted to touch it. It was, the return wasn't there. It just didn't make sense for them. And they actually suggested that we look at doing something publicly owned, because, you know, we don't have to have the same return that they do in the private sector. So we engaged in that. We didn't know how to go forward with it, but we said, okay, we'll give it a shot. And so we put together the 1101 as a publicly owned and financed market rate workforce housing project, a 37 unit apartment project. And it was a challenge. It was new. We ran into lots of obstacles just from statutory authority to be able to do it. The attorneys spent a lot of time figuring out how it could be done. We spent a lot of time figuring out how we would come up with the money locally to make it work. So I don't want to say it was easy. We did come to a successful project that is about half finished right now. But it was definitely unique. And I'd say the biggest thing from a standpoint of what did we learn, or what things, is that, you know, there's just not a lot of help for workforce housing in the market rate. We talk about affordable or income, you know, restricted housing. That's a different animal, and it was really something we couldn't do more of here. And so to try and steer away from that, we really found there are very few resources. And so the workforce housing grant program we found to be invaluable. It was the one thing that allowed us to move this project forward. Without that program, this project just would have never gone anywhere.
And I think I missed what you said, Todd. Who is the developer on the project?
So we engaged DW Jones Management to be our developer because we're not we weren't able to put a project together. So we have a relationship with DW Jones. They manage another building that the City of Roseau owns. So we had a relationship there, and they agreed to work with us on that, but basically with us as the financial aspect of that. I didn't know if you wanted me to go through the slides. I think that's later, so I don't.
Yeah, why don't you do that right now, Todd? That sounds great.
Okay, so if we want to go back to the first slide, this was just kind of explains why we're a little different than and why we have such a hard time getting housing built. If you see the first two, Hennepin and Wright counties, they have lots of high income earners that help drive private development. Developers love to build where there's lots of income, and so there's no need for the subsidy so much on the market rate. But then you look at us versus like Wadena County, because we have two major employers, manufacturers, who provide good wages, but they're right in the middle of the income spectrum. They're not real high, they're not real low. We don't have a lot of people at the low end, and we don't have a lot of people at the high end. So having lots of income restricted housing, we oversupply that when we use any of those programs, but we can't get it built without it. And so that's been a struggle for us here in Roseau County in particular, because the programs just don't work. We need more of the market rate and less of the income restricted. So like for us, a perfect formula would be maybe 90-10 or, you know, somewhere along those lines, but the programs just don't fit that. We get an oversupply, and that becomes a problem of income restricted, or we just don't get anything at all because the developers won't build without some sort of subsidy. So I guess we want to go to the next slide. So what happens to us is because we have low rents, affordable rents, some would say. We run into problems when we try and construct fully market rate housing. So you can see for the 1101, our project had a total cost of about $6.8 million. The appraisal based on the revenue we could get on rents was 5 million. And then the banks will only lend at 80% of appraisal. So they'll only lend us 4 million on a 6.8 million project. So that leaves a huge gap that needs to be filled. So this is immediately why a developer says, yeah, we're not going to build market rate housing in your community, and why we need to fill that with some other subsidy. But with lots of those subsidies, we bring in other restrictions that make it difficult for us to meet the needs of our actual people who need to be housed. So if you want to go to the next slide, what we sought to do was take the financial incentive out and say, we'll own it publicly. We don't need to make a return. We just need to build the product. But then for us, it's difficult in that we're a very small city. We don't have the technical capabilities of putting a project together. And then we also found out we don't have statutory authority to build market rate housing. And then, again, getting back to where do we find the funding partners to fill that gap? Because the city of Rosa doesn't have that kind of money to fill a $2.5 million gap. So if you want to go to the next slide, where this is the imagination we had to come up with to make this project work. And you can see all of these different funders that we needed. So we were able to fund $3.3 million based on revenue from the project. So those would be the rents of the people living there. We were also providing the project with TIF and tax abatement, because again, workforce housing can only get a TIF 9 years. So we had to put a 15-year tax abatement on the back end of that in order to get additional income. The banks were also we had local community banks helping us with this. So they were able to actually lend above 80%, which would be normal. So they gave us the full amount we thought we needed when we originally proposed the project. So they helped us in that way. And then the state workforce housing grant program was the huge godsend with $1.6 million roughly from the state in order to make the project go. And then we had local employers contribute $110,000 to the project. The city of Roseau made a loan to the project, a deferred loan that will get paid back when everybody else gets paid back of just under $300,000. We went to the HRA, the Northwest Multi-County HRA, and they also agreed to split with the city of Roseau on a deferred loan. So they're going to be patient and wait 5 years before they start getting any return, because we won't have any return for at least 5 years. And then the local EDA was the one that put the cash equity injection into the project of $270,000. And then our developer, DW Jones, also is contributing to helping this go by deferring half of their developer fee to only out of income of the project for the first 5 years, they'll get paid. If there's no income out of the project in the first 5 years, they don't get paid. So it was a difficult thing to put together, and a lot of people had to come together to make this one project work. And while I'd like to say this is a great case model, it is a tough one in that City of Roseau couldn't sustain doing this over and over and over and over again. So hopefully we can find additional resources to put towards market rate workforce housing, so that more communities can do that. I don't know that every community would have this kind of resources to be able to put one single project. So that's kind of a quick summary of it.
That's great, Scott. Great example of local creativity. It's really awesome to hear about. Thank you. Let me now finally introduce Wes Johnson, the Program and Loan Officer at Greater Minnesota Housing Fund. Wes is going to describe some statewide examples of innovative projects and building models throughout the state. Wes?
Thanks so much, Tim. It's great to be here with you all today. And thanks, Todd, for going over that awesome example of what you've been able to put together in Roseau. I think that's along the lines of what we're hoping to do more of, and also a great example of why even for some of these workforce housing projects that don't have a lot of income restrictions, we need to bring other resources to the table from local communities to make them happen. I really liked your slide showing the total project cost of the project versus the appraisal value, which was lower, and the amount of loan proceeds that you're able to get from a local bank, because I think that illustrates the problem really well. Like Tim said, I'm a loan officer here at Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, and we provide a full range of financing products for affordable housing production and preservation statewide. And I'm here to present on a new effort we're working on with a foundation partner of ours to provide flexible, innovative financing products to create and preserve about 4,000 affordable homes across the state over the next 5 years. We're hoping to do this without the need for significant outside subsidy, such as the low-income housing tax credit program. And our goal here is to capitalize a fund of $100 to $150 million. And that would allow us to provide about $20 million of new capital annually for the next 5 years or so. And one of the challenges I think that we're trying to overcome is that it's difficult to get tax credit projects done in some of the communities in Greater Minnesota, and there are limited subsidies available from state and federal resources. So we're targeting these affordable workforce housing projects that have no or low subsidy levels in order to expand production and preservation of affordable rental housing beyond what's possible with the limited subsidies from state and federal resources. So what we're providing is a flexible second mortgage or equity-like financing product that allows us to fund up to 95% of the property value. So that kind of gets to the problem Todd was talking about with his local bank, where they were limiting the first mortgage at 80% of value. We're able to get the project up to 95% of value, and then there may be some additional resources needed from the local community or the Minnesota Housing Workforce Grant Program to round out the sources needed to finance a new project. But we're also looking to preserve existing naturally occurring affordable housing, and we're interested in hearing about other innovative opportunities such as hotels to housing or preservation of manufactured home communities in your communities. So I've got a few examples I'm going to run through of projects that kind of illustrate what we're hoping to do. Lakeside Apartments is a project that we weren't involved in. It's in Wyndham and was recently completed. It's a 45-unit workforce housing project that was made possible with TIF from the city and also some inexpensive land. And it was completed for about $125,000 a unit, which is a very low cost. And I think that's a key component of getting some of these projects done in Greater Minnesota, is working on the cost side. We know costs have gone up some since then. This was a year or two ago. And so we do think that to do future projects like this, we will probably need TIF or low cost land or some combination of other support from local communities. But I think it's a good example of, being able to develop a good looking, high quality workforce housing project in a smaller community in Greater Minnesota, much like the one that Todd went over with us in Roseau. The next slide is a summary of the Technology Park project in Rochester. This is a project that we've financed recently. Phase 1 was recently completed just a year ago or so, and was 164 units that was built for $120,000 a unit. And phase 2 is just about to start construction here in the spring. And that's another 140 units with a total cost of $153,000 a unit. It's a mixed income project. It's serving 60% AMI and 80% AMI households, with some of the units also at market rates. And we're providing a second mortgage, a low cost second mortgage behind a Freddie Mac first mortgage, along with a little bit of equity from the developer. And that's the whole that's the entire sources of funds for this project. So there is no subsidy coming from the city. I think part of that is due to, you know, Rochester having higher rents than other communities, very low vacancy rates. And so we think that other local support will likely be needed on similar workforce housing projects in other communities in greater Minnesota, but it's a good example of what's possible with very little subsidy. The next slide is Center Street Village Apartments. This is also in Rochester, and it's an example of preservation of naturally occurring affordable housing. So this is an existing 36 unit apartment building that was acquired in 2020 by Rochester First Homes. And it preserves the existing rents as affordable at about 50% AMI. The total project cost was $3.2 million or $90,000 a unit. And the project included the acquisition of the project itself, along with recapitalizing replacement reserves to keep the property well maintained for the long term. Greater Minnesota Housing Fund provided a low-cost, long-term amortizing first mortgage at 80% loan to value for this project. And then local philanthropic dollars provided the equity, but we also approved a second mortgage that would have covered most of the project costs. It's just the community had some other resources lined up for this project. The next slide is 907 Dale Street in Hutchinson. This is another example of preservation of an existing apartment building without tax credits. And it's a 40-unit project. The total project cost was $2.1 million, or about $52,000 a unit. And it included the refinance of existing debt, as well as about $18,000 per unit of rehab. So they were able to complete, replace the siding, new asphalt, doors and windows, and this preserved rents of about $575 for a 1-bedroom and $650 for a 2-bedroom. On this project, it's a good example of being able to layer multiple sources of financing to complete a project in a rural community. So there was some deed small cities funding and funding from the HRA, along with a small amount of owner equity in order to complete this rehab. So the next slide, there are some terms that we're considering for the low cost second mortgage financing. As I mentioned, excuse me, this is up to 95% loan to value. So you might have a first mortgage up to 80%, and that might be from GMHF or another lender. And then the second mortgage going up to 95% of value. The interest is paid from available cash flow, so there aren't fixed payments. We're targeting about a 7% interest rate for this funding, but it's paid from cash flow. The term is up to 35 years to match the first mortgage. And there are some affordability restrictions that come along with this. So it's 40% of the units have to be affordable at 60% AMI or 20% at 50% AMI. And then up to 25% of the units can be unrestricted or market rate, and the remaining units can be affordable at or below 80% AMI. So it really is targeting that a range of incomes where the market rate units are helping support some of the more affordable units, but there's also, you know, these 80% AMI units. That's a sort of middle income in most communities for renter households. And then, so we are envisioning that it would be paired with financing from others. It might be a GMHF first mortgage or from another lender, like on the Tech Park project where Freddie Mac was involved. We think that tax increment financing will be key to many of these projects, as well as other support from local employers, EDAs, cities, or philanthropies. And if you can go to the next slide. This is, again, this is new capital. We're looking actively to identify new housing partners. So for-profit and nonprofit developers, EDAs, cities, employers, that want to work with us on these projects. And if you have questions, I would love to hear from you. My contact information is listed on this slide, as well as on GMHF's website. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that overview, Wes. That was really great. Just to characterize what we just heard from the three presenters, it seems it's getting more and more important that we look to use the funding sources that are available more and more creatively over time. Housing development, especially at the multifamily level, is not getting any easier to pull together. The layering of resources is really critical, and it seems as though the response is different depending on the specific needs of each individual community that we're working with. One of the things that was apparent to me in listening to the presentations of all three presenters is that there are a lot of partners involved in pulling together a successful project. That includes funding partners, but also other partners that are committed to responding to local needs and finding ways to, using Todd's words, going through the challenges that come with projects like this, and just not taking no for an answer and finding ways to get past all the barriers that end up getting thrown in your way. I want to applaud all of you for the great work that you're doing and making a significant difference in housing supply in the region. And I appreciate everybody's willingness to present on these topics this morning.
Well, thanks, Tim, and thanks everybody on this panel. It's always great to hear project models, innovative ideas, and things that we can replicate in other parts of the state or even within the region. And as you heard, I'll just tag on to what Wes was talking about. Greater Minnesota Housing Fund is suggesting and encouraging the advancement of workforce housing without subsidy or with low or no subsidy, probably usually TIF, but not much else. And it's a little bit of threading the needle to control costs or value engineer it. But the result is workforce housing that doesn't need tax credits. So there are limited tax credits available, and then we're all looking for something else to do to create more housing. And so this is one way to consider. So we look forward to talking to more of you about that. We're right up on our, we're within a minute of being on time, and we can definitely wrap up in the next 5 minutes. I just want to flag a couple of takeaways, and other people will have more, I'm sure. And please do connect with each other, connect with any of the panelists, and we'll circulate the emails, the contact information, so that we can all network together. But I would say that perhaps the most timely and important takeaway is kind of bookending this conversation. You heard the commissioner at the beginning talk about kind of a once in a lifetime, once in a generation opportunity for the state to act in a big way on housing, and the governor's thinking big, and the agency is going to be working hard at the legislature on that. We heard Dan Kitzenberger talking about the same thing. This is really a key moment in our state's history with this surplus and with the federal dollars that are coming into the state to really get our lawmakers educated, persuaded this session, starting in the next couple of weeks, to get housing on the front burner and to make a major investment. And of course, the advocates are, as Elizabeth Glidden pointed out from MHP, are rallying around a $2 billion ask for housing for both production and home ownership and so forth. So once in a lifetime, and so stay tuned. Homes for All is going to be communicating and gathering support and working throughout the state. There are 200 organizations that are members of Homes for All throughout Minnesota, all over greater Minnesota. And this is really a moment to work together on state funding for affordable housing. So that's the big takeaway, I think. But in terms of the content for all of us who are practitioners and working at the state or at the local level, we're seeing models that are, some new, some need to be replicated even more. And so we want to continue to share those models and be a resource. I think we're going to wrap up. I'll just formally thank all the presenters and and everybody that attended.